Following the end of the New Sith Wars, the Ruusan reformations officially dissolved the Republic military, replacing it with a more decentralized system that emphasized local forces instead of a large, centrally controlled military. For centuries, this system worked well, but cracks eventually started to show in it, and some in the Republic began to call for its replacement. These militarists got their wish with the creation of the Grand Army of the Republic, the final evolutionary stage of the Republic military. In this video, we'll be discussing the rise of the Republic's clone army and how it brought the age of the Republic to an end.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
For defense in the post-Ruusan era, the Republic primarily relied on the Planetary Security Forces, or PSFs. The PSFs were actually a pretty old institution. They had originally been created 15,000 years before the Battle of Yavin to provide extra defense for outlying sectors threatened by Hutt activity. For most of history though, they were mostly just Republic Navy auxiliaries, and following the Ruusan reformations, they swelled in size and became much more important. The old academies of the Republic military were converted for the use of PSFs from across the galaxy, with the College of Planetary Security Forces on Anaxis being the most prestigious. The PSFs were controlled by their sector governments, albeit with Republic oversight, and they were thus designed according to local standards. Each one was unique, with its own traditions, ranks, training standards, and equipment. As a result of these different standards, as well as different levels of funding, the quality of PSFs could vary wildly. Some were renowned for their high standards and effectiveness, among these the Asceno Rangers, the Lantillian Planetary Security Force, the Garde d'Azur, the Herté Home Brigade, and the Greater Pleuroid Warriors. Others were critically underfunded and rife with corruption, rendering them completely ineffective. Wealth played a major role in this. While wealthy sectors in the core could supply their PSFs with state-of-the-art ships and equipment, those on the rim could usually only afford to maintain what ships they had. Originally, these poorer sectors benefited from inheriting old Republic Navy assets, but as the years dragged on, these became hopelessly obsolete, and the rim PSFs just couldn't afford to replace them. In the hopes of keeping the peace, the Ruusan reformations also placed a number of restrictions on the size and capabilities of PSF assets. Capital ships that were more than 600 meters long were restricted to slow-as-hell Class 5 hyperdrives and generally forbidden from leaving their home sectors, and there were also strict limits on how much firepower these capital ships could have. PSFs were also limited in the size of their fleets, although these limits could be relaxed or waived for frontier sectors, in theory. In practice, it was actually the wealthy sectors in the core that got around these regulations, mainly by using legal loopholes that allowed military shipyards to possess fleets of their own for demonstration purposes. These shipyards could make lend-lease deals with sectors that could afford them, and many core sectors abused this to greatly increase the size of the fleets under their control, without actually incorporating them into the PSFs. Fleets assembled in this way, known as demonstration fleets, weren't regulated by the Ruusan reformations, so sector governments could use them to legally establish fleets well beyond the official limits. Since the wealthy sectors that amassed these demonstration fleets of barely legal battleships did so mostly as vanity projects, this loophole was never dealt with. Then there were the Judicial Forces, a branch of the Judicial Department which answered to the Galactic Senate. The Judicial Forces were what was left of the centralized Republic military. They were a small, professional military force, albeit one geared more for peacekeeping than for war, and they were meant to operate alongside the Jedi Order in intervening in situations the PSFs couldn't handle. The Judicial Forces consisted of a small force of skilled soldiers trained at the Judicial Academy on Coruscant, distinguishable by their navy blue uniforms, which earned judicial personnel the nickname Bluecoats. They maintained a small but top-of-the-line fleet, primarily consisting of smaller cruisers, frigates, and corvettes, which was usually tasked with rapid response actions. In the early centuries of the Republic Golden Age, the Judicial Forces played a crucial role in reunifying the galaxy, putting out fires and bringing an end to local wars. Initially, the judicial forces were a prestigious institution, inheriting the glory and traditions of the old Republic military, but they began to decline as the Great Peace of the Republic wore on. The judicial forces were repeatedly rocked by corruption scandals over the centuries, and attempts to revitalize them met with disaster. In one infamous instance, the Senate commissioned a fleet of 200 dreadnought-class heavy cruisers, the Katana fleet for the judicial forces navy, only for the entire fleet to be lost without a trace after the crews succumbed to a hive virus. The whole judicial forces PSF system is sometimes construed as a misstep by some fans and by in-universe militarists, but for the first few centuries after Rusan, it worked incredibly well. It came as a relief to a war-weary galaxy, and it convinced many systems in the Outer Rim that had grown skeptical of the Republic's motives that it really was changing things for the better. Contributed greatly to the stability of the Republic Golden Age, and initially, the new system was sufficient to defend the Republic against threats. Many in the Republic believed that the dissolution of the Republic military was a positive change, and with the hindsight of how the reformation of the Republic military went, they were probably right. But as we've already discussed, the post-Rusan system wasn't perfect. As PSFs in the Rim began to decline in quality due to the poverty of their home sectors, an epidemic of piracy began in the Outer Rim. This, combined with steadily mounting crises brought into being by the Sith, steadily began to erode faith in the new system, and some began calling for the Republic military's return. The leader of this militarist faction was the senator from the Seswena sector, a man named Ranulf Tarkin. A wealthy oligarch of Eriadu's Tarkin family, Ranulf Tarkin had incredible political power, which he primarily used to push the militarist cause. He had served as an officer in his sector's PSF, the Seswena Defense Forces, and during his service, he had led several successful campaigns against the pirates that plagued the outer reaches of the sector. This led him to believe that military force was the only solution to the scourge of piracy and the breakdown of so-called law and order in the Outer Rim, and Tarkin was quite belligerent in his devotion to pushing this message. When it became that his position was well in the minority, Ranulf Tarkin sought to put the militarist program into action himself. Tarkin began his militarist crusade by leaving the SDF and becoming an executive at Quintard Orbital Manufacturing, a Tarkin family-owned shipbuilding firm. He used this position to turn QOM into a military shipbuilder, and he convinced the Republic's other military shipbuilders to start operating out of QOM's shipyards. Once QOM had been reconfigured to his liking, Tarkin handed it off to a cousin and talked the Seswena sector's senator into appointing him the sector's governor general, which put him in charge of the Seswena Defense Forces. By 57 BBY, everything was in order, and Governor General Tarkin set about the remilitarization of the Seswena sector. As Governor General, Tarkin commissioned a fleet of new, state-of-the-art military warships from QOM and its new partners. The Judicials, however, weren't too happy about this. Tarkin's new fleet exceeded several of the caps the Rusan reformations placed on the PSFs, and so the Judicials shut down Tarkin's pet project, to the Governor General's fury. But it would take a lot more than that to end Tarkin's crusade. For his plan B, he turned to the same Lend-Lease loophole that the core worlds used for their navies, amassing enormous demonstration fleets under the de facto control of the SDF. Tarkin then began striking mutual defense pacts with neighboring sectors left and right, leveraging the wealth of the Seswena sector to gain influence over the largely poor sectors that made up the western reaches. In exchange for a substantial economic boost from the Seswena sector, these neighboring sectors combined their planetary security forces with the SDF under the banner of the Outland Region's Security Forces, which was under the ultimate command of Governor General Tarkin. The ORSF member PSFs would share ships, personnel, and navigational data, and they would treat their combined territory as a single theater of operations, an oversector. By this point, Tarkin's crusade had evolved in scope. He didn't just want to remilitarize the Republic anymore, he he had become convinced that the Republic needed to do away with the Rusan reformations entirely and re-establish its central military. As he himself openly claimed, he wasn't just building up the Outlands region's security force as a local unit, he wanted it to be the foundation on which a new Republic military would be built, an example for the Senate to follow. Tarkin even instructed ORSF personnel to refer to themselves as soldiers in the Republic Navy or the Republic Army. This made the project even more troubling to Tarkin's opponents, especially given how Tarkin had essentially bought the cooperation of neighboring sectors for the project, and the fact that the ORSF exclusively recruited human personnel. The militarist faction as a whole was rife with speciesism, and the imperialist approach Tarkin had taken in establishing the ORSF's oversector, which he referred to as the Greater Seswena, was an unfortunate harbinger of what was to come. In 54 BBY, Ranulph Tarkin handed command of the ORSF off to another of his cousins, while he went to Coruscant to push militarist positions as the Seswena sector senator. As senator, Tarkin waged a highly publicized legal battle with the judicial forces over their enforcement of the Rusan Reformation, all while calling for remilitarization at every possible opportunity. For about a decade, his arguments largely fell on deaf ears, but things started to change after the Stark Hyperspace War. This brief but highly consequential conflict took place in 44 BBY, and it saw the Stark Commercial Combine, a coalition of pirates and unscrupulous corporate actors, attempt to seize economic control of the Republic via cyber warfare and armed force. The Senate attempted to resolve the situation peacefully with a summit on Troikan, but Ranulph Tarkin messed that up by gatecrashing the summit with the full force of the ORSF, intent on wiping out the Stark Combine once and for all. Most of Tarkin's ships were destroyed by the Combine's computer viruses, however, and what was left of the ORSF suffered brutal casualties in the brief war that followed. The Republic ultimately came out on top in the war thanks to Jedi leadership, Trade Federation reinforcements, and Tarkin's men, but the Stark Hyperspace War nonetheless gave the militarists their wedge issue. Ranulph Tarkin, the militarist faction's leader, died in the war, but if anything, this only made his cause stronger. The militarists held him up as a hero, and they used his memory to keep pushing for remilitarization. In the years that followed, crises continued to mount in the Republic, culminating in the Battle of Naboo in 32 BBY. With each crisis, the militarists grew stronger, and after the start of the Separatist crisis in 24 BBY, they began a serious push for Republic remilitarization, leading to what eventually became the Military Creation Act of 22 BBY. Unbeknownst to the militarists, however, a new Republic military was already well on its way by that point, and the final chapter of Republic history was about to begin. In 32 BBY, the Jedi Master Cypher Dyas, spurred on by premonitions of an army of darkness sweeping across the galaxy, traveled to the remote planet of Camino on a tip from the IGBC executive Hego Damask. There, Cypher Dyas, acting on behalf of the Jedi, placed an order for an enormous army of clones to be created for the Republic's use, and the Kaminoans immediately set to work on the project. Unbeknownst to Cypher Dyas, he had just ordered the creation of the very army of darkness he had foreseen, for Hego Damask was actually the Sith Lord, Darth Plagueis, who had convinced Cypher Dyas to lay the groundwork for the final stage of the Sith's plan to conquer the galaxy. Shortly after Cypher Dyas' initial visit to Camino, he was killed by his old friend, the ex-Jedi Master Dooku. Dooku, under the guise of Lord Tyrannus, took over the project, recruiting Jango Fett to be the Kaminoans' prime clone, while Darth Sidious, in his day-to-day guise as Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, funneled funding to the project from the Republic budget. The Kaminoans weren't privy to any of these manipulations, of course. As far as they knew, the project was sanctioned, and they didn't care to investigate, knowing that the army had to be created in the strictest secrecy anyway. Instead, they set to work rebuilding the Republic military from the ground up. The creation of this new military was a very deliberate and thoroughly interconnected process. There were none of the long periods of evolution that earlier stages of the Republic military had undergone. The Kaminoans planned out everything from equipment and training to unit organization and fleet composition, designing it all to work together according to a single, cohesive battle plan. They created and trained all of the army's personnel with the assistance of Jango Fett and a group of mercenaries he recruited to train commandos, and they made secret contracts with Rathana Heavy Engineering, Blastic Industries, and others to design starships, vehicles, and weaponry for the new force. The result was a fully formed military that seemed to appear out of nowhere on the eve of the Clone Wars, which even came pre-equipped with its own standard tactics. In 22 BBY, after the Senate learned that the Separatists were amassing an enormous droid army on Geonosis, the Military Creation Act was passed, and Supreme Chancellor Palpatine declared that the Republic military was to be rebuilt. No sooner had this announcement been made than the Grand Army of the Republic descended on Geonosis under the command of the Jedi. Just like that, the Clone Wars had begun, and the Republic military was back. The Republic spent the first half of the Clone Wars remilitarizing, but this process was made much easier by the Kaminoans, who had delivered a full-fledged military that just needed leadership. While the Kaminoans had primarily been contracted to assemble a ground force, the new Grand Army of the Republic, they also laid the groundwork for a rebuilt Republic Navy and Republic Starfighter Corps, assembling a basic fleet of capital ships and training squadrons of clone pilots. The Kaminoans also delivered a fourth military branch, the Republic Special Operations Brigade, which consisted of elite commando units. All the Republic had to do was fill the new military's upper leadership roles and rebuild its military-industrial complex to support the new force. The first of these tasks was easy. The GAR was designed to be led by the Jedi after all, and the Jedi had already taken command of the army during the Battle of Geonosis. A month into the war, Palpatine made Jedi Command official by drafting all members of the Jedi Order to serve as GAR officers via executive order. Additional leadership roles, especially in the Navy, were handed out to high-ranking officers from the judicial forces and planetary security forces. Supporting the new military wasn't all that much harder, although it did take longer. The Republic's old military academies were all still around to service the judicial forces and PSFs after all, and they had an easy time switching gears to training new Republic military officers. The Republic still had plenty of weapons manufacturers and military shipbuilders that were all too eager to take on massive government contracts. It took a while for the Republic to commit the full weight of its industrial might to the war effort and to establish robust supply lines and support networks, but these obstacles still weren't insurmountable. Alongside the Republic's new clone army, it also made use of its existing forces, the Judicials and PSFs, during the Clone Wars. After the Battle of Geonosis, the Judicial forces were assimilated back into the Republic military. The small Judicial fleet became part of the Navy, while the Judicial's ground units were reorganized into the Grand Army of the Republic. Many Judicial personnel were promoted to officer ranks and put in command of clone units to fill out the military's upper ranks. The PSFs, meanwhile, initially remained independent, left under the command of their sector governments. This presented problems for the Republic, as the PSFs of separatist sectors usually followed the lead of their parent governments and sided with the Confederacy, and in some sectors, PSFs split into factions, fighting small civil wars of their own. Those PSFs that remained loyalist, however, played a vital role in the Clone Wars. Though the Clone Wars are often thought of as a clash between the Republic's clone army and the Confederacy's droid army, this wasn't always the case. To quote the Essential Guide to Warfare, many of the battles of the Clone Wars were fought between armies of organics, with barely a battle droid or clone trooper in sight. In some divided sectors, battles were fought by soldiers on both sides wearing identical uniforms, and opposing fleets were made up of the same classes of warships and starfighters, with only new insignia and hastily applied coats of paint indicating the change of allegiance. In fact, the Clone Wars might best be described as a vast collection of local wars fought primarily by the PSFs, which the centralized armies of both sides intervened in on crucial fronts. With all that said, Loyalist PSFs didn't get to remain fully independent. Personnel from the PSFs, especially officers, were regularly drafted for roles in the main Republic military, which also borrowed fleets and other assets from the PSFs from time to time. This pattern of control grew until after the Battle of Rendili, midway through the war, when the Senate voted to just nationalize the PSFs and be done with it. The PSFs weren't entirely merged into the Republic military, but most of their important assets were, and those PSFs that were left partially independent were still shadows of their former selves, essentially reserve units for the main military to draw upon. Speaking of, let's talk about the new Republic military, starting with the GAR itself. The Grand Army of the Republic was the spiritual successor to the Republic Army, but in practice, it was a vastly different institution. It was mostly composed of Kaminoan-grown clone troopers, for one thing, although it did have a number of units composed of soldiers that had either assimilated from the Judicial Forces or PSFs, or recruited during the war, and clone units were often led by recruited officers. These clones brought an entirely new ethos and set of traditions to the Republic military, many of them based on Mandalorian traditions handed down to them by Jango Fett, and they followed an entirely new command structure and order of battle. The lowest rank in the GAR was that of Trooper, or Private for recruited soldiers. Above this were the ranks of Corporal, Sergeant, and Sergeant Major, which held leadership roles within squads, the GAR's smallest organizational unit. Each squad consisted of 9 clone troopers led by a sergeant or sergeant major, with one of the 9 troopers being a corporal and the squad's second in command. The next level up was the platoon, consisting of 36 clone troopers plus officers in 4 squads. Platoons were commanded by lieutenants who came in second class and first class grades. Above the rank of lieutenant were the ranks of captain and major, both of which commanded companies of 144 clone troopers in 4 platoons. This pattern continued through to the higher levels of organization. 4 companies, or 576 clone troopers, made up a battalion. 4 battalions, or 2,304 troopers, made up a regiment. 4 regiments, or 9,216 troopers, made up a brigade or legion, and 4 of those made up a corps, with a total of 36,864 clone troopers plus officers. All of these units were commanded by commanders, a rank that came in 4 different levels: the ranks of battalion commander, regimental commander, senior commander, and marshal commander. The latter rank was the highest that any clone could achieve, although recruited soldiers could reach higher ranks exclusive to them, such as colonel and brigadier general. The higher commander ranks typically worked alongside Jedi officers, although Jedi could also attach themselves to smaller units as they saw fit. Jedi were given different ranks depending on their rank within the Jedi Order. Padawans became Jedi commanders, while knights and masters became Jedi generals, and the most esteemed masters became senior generals or high generals. Jedi commanders were usually attached to regiments, while standard Jedi generals commanded brigades or corps. The higher Jedi general ranks commanded the GAR's highest organizational levels, the sector armies and the systems armies. There were 20 sector armies, each under the command of a Jedi senior general, each of which was assigned to a specific theater of the galaxy. These originally each consisted of 4 corps, or 147,456 troopers in total. 2 sector armies made up a systems army, which originally contained 294,912 troopers, and which was commanded by a Jedi High General, the rank assigned to the members of the Jedi Council. Originally, when the sector armies contained just 4 corps each, these were divided up according to the 1-4-16-64 plan. This plan was conceived as a simple but efficient way to maintain control of an oversector by dividing up the sector armies' corps into progressively smaller operational units. One corps would remain intact as a reserve assault division, deployed in full to capture hard targets, usually amounting to an entire star system. Another would operate as 4 brigades, which could take control of most important systems, while a third would split into 16 regiments for standard planetary engagements. The 4th would operate as 64 battalions, which would act as rapid response strike units, which could capture a mined colony or an urban district. When necessary, companies, platoons, or squads could be detached from any of these units when a mission required it. In practice, however, this plan quickly fell apart, and even before the number of corps in a sector army expanded, the sector armies had settled on keeping one corps intact and breaking up the others into a few dozen battalions and hundreds of fast-moving raiding companies. On top of this efficient command structure, the Grand Army of the Republic came with all sorts of cool toys, from personal equipment to vehicles. The exceptional skill and training of the Republic's clone troopers, which was on par with elite soldiers, was matched by exceptional equipment, including full-body plastoid armor suits and an arsenal of high-powered blasters. Recruited soldiers were generally afforded less protection and tended to be less skilled, but they had access to the same weapons at least. These infantry were supported by a vast array of assault vehicles, from speeder bikes to repulsor lift tanks to walkers. In the first months of the war, the GAR primarily relied on SPHAT artillery, the 74Z speeder bike, the BARC speeder, and 3 classes of walker, the ATRT, ATXT, and ATTE. For air support, the GAR received extensive assistance from LAAT gunships. This vehicle arsenal swelled in size as the war went on, bolstered by the addition of new crafts, large and small, from the ISP Swamp Speeder to the Juggernaut tank and the AT-AT. The GAR also came equipped with a standard battle plan for use in planetary invasions. In textbook engagements, the army would be brought to a planet by acclimated class assault ships, which would descend into its upper atmosphere and deploy waves of LAATs. LAAT gunships would deploy the first wave of clone troopers, which would form a battle line and clear away an assembly area, while LAAT/C dropships would drop off vehicles to reinforce them. Speeder bikes or scout walkers would be sent out for reconnaissance or flanking attacks, while the main force pressed forward under Jedi leadership with support from ATTEs and other heavy vehicles. While additional waves of clones and vehicles were deployed via gunship, the assault ships would land and deploy the rest of their forces, including all SPHATs and all other heavy vehicles that were too large for LAAT/Cs to carry. This vanguard would follow behind the early waves, obliterating everything that the first waves hadn't yet dealt with. All the while, ATTEs would act as mobile command posts and rally points for infantry, while LAAT/Is would act as hubs for the Republic BattleNet, monitoring comms from their attached units and swooping in to provide air support or reinforcements. Either could deploy medical droids and recover wounded as needed. On top of the main GAR, the Kaminoans also built up a second, smaller clone army, the Special Operations Brigade. Consisting of elite commandos and ARC troopers, the Special Operations Brigade had its own, completely different rank structure and order of battle. The basic unit in the brigade was the Squad, which consisted of 4 clone commandos, one of whom had the rank of sergeant and commanded the squad. Most of the time, Republic commandos just operated as part of their squads, as larger formations tended to defeat the point of covert commando units, but there were larger units above the squad level for organizational purposes. 5 squads, or 20 commandos, made up a troop, which was commanded by a Jedi commander. 5 troops, or 100 commandos, made up a company commanded by an ARC commander, and 5 companies, or 500 commandos, made up a commando group commanded by a Jedi general. There were 10 commando groups, a total of 5,000 clone commandos in the Special Operations Brigade, which was commanded by Jedi General Arligan Zay. Originally, there were 10,000 personnel in the Special Operations Brigade, but heavy casualties in the Battle of Geonosis cut that number in half. Then there were the Republic Navy and the Republic Starfighter Corps. While the Grand Army of the Republic was an entirely new unit rather than a continuation of the old Republic Army, the Navy and the Starfighter Corps were revivals of old institutions, and they inherited most of their standards and traditions from their predecessors, particularly the Navy. Nonetheless, they were still staffed, at least partially, by clones, and their modern iterations had their roots in Kaminoan designs. The Starfighter Corps especially was a clone-dominated branch, although recruited fighter pilots began to pop up as the war went on. In practice, This new iteration of the Starfighter Corps operated more or less as a subsidiary of the Navy or the Grand Army. In space, interceptors provided defense for capital ships, while snub fighters carried out attack runs against enemy fleets. In planetary atmospheres, starfighters primarily provided ground support for the Grand Army and intercepted enemy fighters doing the same thing. Nonetheless, the Starfighter Corps as a branch retained its independence for historical reasons. The Corps operated a ton of different starfighter models over the course of the Clone Wars, as it struggled to keep up with the superior starfighter forces of the Confederacy. Notable designs from different points in the war included the V-19 Torrent, the Y-Wing Bomber, the ARC-170, and the V-Wing. The Corps' organization was relatively simple. The smallest unit in the Starfighter Corps was the Section, which consisted of 2 to 4 starfighters under the command of a lieutenant, while 2 sections, or 4 to 8 starfighters, made up a flight commanded by a captain. The most commonly seen unit in the Starfighter Corps, the Squadron, contained 3 to 4 flights, or 12 to 32 starfighters, under the command of either a Major or a Jedi Commander. Above the Squadron was the Wing, which contained 3 to 10 squadrons, or 36 to 320 starfighters, under the command of a Commander or Jedi General. The highest level of organization within the Starfighter Corps, the Group, consisted of 2 wings, 72 to 640 starfighters total, under the command of a Clone Commander or Senior Jedi General. Sections and flights were usually only detached for patrol duties or special missions, and starfighters were usually deployed in squadrons. Wings represented the total carrying capacity of most Republic capital ships, while groups represented the total starfighter capacity of the average Republic Navy battle group. Both were usually split up into squadrons, but they were sometimes deployed in force for large battles. Then there was the Republic Navy itself. The Navy was a bit of an outlier in the Clone Wars era Republic military for 2 key reasons. The first is that the Kaminoans didn't really plan out a full Navy. They didn't have the experience, so they just commissioned a lot of assault ships and figured that the Republic would sort out the rest. The other is that most of the personnel within the Republic Navy weren't actually clones. While there were clones in the Navy, both enlisted personnel and officers, the majority of the Navy's ranks were composed of former judicials, conscripts from the PSFs, or recruits. This meant that the New Republic Navy pretty much just defaulted back to the Old Republic Navy's traditions and structures without many changes brought on by the Kaminoans. On the contrary, the old guard of the Old Republic Navy seized the reins of the new force pretty much straight away. While the Navy had been gone for a millennium, its legacy officer families and traditions had lived on in the judicial forces and PSFs. The Republic Navy's new officers were mostly drawn from those units, and they made sure to immediately resurrect all the old traditions of the Republic Navy, as well as its former tactics, organizational structure, and general approach to warfare. The only real shift in the Navy was in the classes of capital ships it relied on. The start of the Clone Wars killed the old strategy of primarily relying on large groups of smaller, faster vessels, replacing it with a new age of enormous heavy cruisers and battleships, spurred on by the first ships of a new and soon-to-be infamous class, the Star Destroyers. Initially, the Republic Navy primarily consisted of Acclamator-class assault ships supported by whatever smaller vessels the Republic could muster, from refitted Consular-class cruisers to Carrack-class light cruisers, Architans-class light cruisers, and Dreadnought-class heavy cruisers. But as the war went on, the Acclamator was supplanted as the Republic Navy's capital ship of choice by the first Star Destroyers. The Venator-class Star Destroyer became the Republic Navy's backbone, and it was later joined by the Victory-class Star Destroyer. In the later stages of the war, the Navy began using even larger vessels as command ships, the likes of Praetor and Maelstrom-class battle cruisers and Mandator II-class Star Dreadnoughts. By the final days of the war, the Navy's suppliers were working on new, even more powerful Star Destroyers to complement the Venator, these being the Tector and Imperator class. All of these ships, from the puny Carrack class to the 8-kilometer-long Mandator II class, were each commanded by a captain, or rarely a Jedi commander. Strictly speaking, captains commanded a Republic Navy unit called an element, but this was just technical speak for individual capital ships. These vessels were mixed and matched as part of the Navy's larger organizational units, the smallest of which was the section. Sections of larger ships were called the lines and contained 3 or 4 ships, while sections of smaller vessels were called flotillas and contained 6 to 12 ships. Sections were commanded by the senior-most captain or Jedi commander, and they handled most missions outside of major naval engagements. 3 to 4 sections made up a squadron, consisting of 12 to 36 capital ships plus support units. Usually, squadrons maintained a mix of lines and flotillas, and they were commanded by a commodore or a Jedi general. Squadrons could handle most direct naval engagements, and individual squadrons were usually designed for a specific purpose, such as defensive screening, blockade actions, or pursuit. 2 to 4 squadrons, usually all of different types, made up a battle group, commanded by an admiral or Jedi general. Battle groups contained 48 to 72 warships plus support units, and they were usually the largest naval force deployed to a single battle. 3 to 6 battle groups, or 1 to 300 capital ships plus support units, made up a fleet, commanded by a fleet admiral. These were usually theater-scale units assigned to particular sectors, and Republic Navy fleets only rarely operated as single units, typically for particularly massive battles. There were hundreds of fleets in the Republic Navy, spread all across the galaxy. Some fleets were grouped up into armadas, massive forces of 1 to 5,000 ships that represented all the naval forces assigned to a particular theater of the Clone Wars. Armadas were only semi-formal units, typically assigned to a systems army and commanded by a high Jedi general, and they could vary widely in scale. All told, the structure and overall function of the Republic military didn't really evolve at all during the Clone Wars. The military's tactics got better and some aspects of it adapted to match, but these were mostly situational rather than organizational changes. Apart from the nationalization of the PSFs and the steady shift of Republic industry to a war footing, the Republic military mostly remained constant throughout the Clone Wars, except where leadership was concerned. The Republic Armed Forces as a whole technically answered to Republic High Command, which was led by the Chief of Defense Staff, and answered jointly to the Senate and the Jedi High Council. In practice, most upper leadership decisions were made directly by the Jedi Council, since they were all generals anyway, often in informal consultation with the Supreme Chancellor. This was within the spirit of the original structure, since High Command was supposed to answer to both of these anyway. The Jedi Councilor's dual places on the hierarchy just allowed them to cut out the middlemen, except where things like funding were concerned. But toward the end of the Clone Wars, the Senate started to take away some of the Jedi's military authority, which it promptly handed to the Supreme Chancellor. Toward the end of the war, this shift became official, and the Senate officially named Supreme Chancellor Palpatine the Supreme Commander of the Republic military. From that point forward, High Command answered directly to Palpatine, and the Jedi answered to them. This came at roughly the same time as the Sector Governance Decree, an amendment to the Constitution that implemented 2 new positions, that of Planetary Governor and that of Sector Moff. These positions would be both military and political, and they created an entirely separate command structure that was only accountable to the Supreme Chancellor, circumventing the Senate entirely. Planetary governors were military officials assigned to enforce local government's loyalty to the Republic, both through political means and, when needed, military support. The Moffs, meanwhile, were handed command of the sector armies, initially sharing these commands with the senior Jedi generals. They answered solely to the Supreme Commander, i.e. Palpatine, and they had 2 roles: commanding sector armies alongside the Jedi and overseeing the political administration of oversectors. The Moffs strengthened Palpatine's control over the Republic military, allowing him to bypass the Jedi completely, and they also rendered the Senate completely redundant, stripping it and the local governments of all control over military forces. The Moff system allowed Palpatine to rule the galaxy directly through the military, giving him absolute political and martial authority. This system, as you can probably tell by now, transformed the Republic into the Empire in all but name, and it only took a few days for this change to become official. That was the purpose of the sector governance decree, of course, and of the new Republic military as a whole. All throughout the Clone Wars, the Republic military steadily grew in scale, and more of the Republic was converted to supporting it. As the Republic shifted to a war footing, everything about it was militarized, even as the Republic military began to beat back the Separatists and begin the Outer Rim sieges. By the end, the Republic had transformed into a de facto military dictatorship, and as the war came to an end and the CIS ceased to exist, the transformation only accelerated. With the issuance of Order 66, the Jedi Order was removed from command and all but exterminated, and with them out of the way, the transformation became official. The Galactic Republic became the Galactic Empire. In this new state, the Imperial military would rule the galaxy pretty much directly on the Emperor's behalf, building up the groundwork laid during the Clone Wars to usher in a new age of tyranny. But what do you think? What's your favorite era of Republic military history? Make sure you let us know that and more in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.